Historical side note is that Rodney Alcala is known as the dating game killer because he was once a contestant on the dating game. He won, but the woman didn't go on a date with him because she felt he was creepy. So, smart lady. So a few of the women he approached became his victims. Most did not. The minor hysteria that accompanied the release of 90 of these photographs, a move ostensibly motivated by an attempt on the part of the police department to identify undocumented and unrecovered victims and to resolve cold cases potentially linked to Alcala, is one phrased in the panic that circles around organizations of law and order when they are challenged with that thing that they are designed around, namely the documentation and, by extension, control of political and cultural subjects, us. Alcala's archive and our response to seeing it, the photographs were published in various media news outlets. You can find it on the internet, you can find them in newspapers back in March of 2010, is one that both mirrors and complicates the aims of the institution that provided it for consumption. So our looking at this archive is one that is rooted both as subjects of institutions and subjects who consume aesthetic objects like photographs to begin with. Looking at photographic archives, such as Alcala's, illustrates the dual thought that underlies our understanding of archives as a general mode of production and leads us to the question of photographic archives, for whom and by whom are they created. Looking at the photographic archives of someone like Rodney Alcala was a really interesting way for me to begin thinking about photographic archives in general, who makes them, who they're created for, who consumes them, and how they're handled, how they trade hands. So looking at Alcala's archive, which these images are from his archive, he had many of them. They're quite beautiful. I still really get a lot of pleasure looking at them. So we experience the body of work in two ways. Like, on one hand, we're appalled and we're saddened, and that's the proper response and one that is expected and programmed for us. As normative political and cultural subjects, our response to the creepiness of such an archive is one that is bound up with the complicity of the aims of the organizations of law and order, whose presentation of the archive as a trespass guides us towards an understanding of these photographs as documents that function as evidence, objects to be handled towards a practical goal of resolution. We're instructed to identify. When they gave us these archives, they wanted us to identify an action that places us within the context of the law as upkeepers and affirmers of it. This action marks our cooperation as subjects within that sphere. Our moral indignation when we look at these is a response coded as subject formation. So when we look, we're tools of the organization which asks us to mimic the processes that define it. Thus, our look is motivated, it's regulated, and it's bound up with those processes of identification, judgment, and documentation. So we're empowered in the sense that literally we're granted the authority of the law by this aim. So we become like the eyes of a security camera when we are asked to function in this way by governmental organizations that provide this kind of archive. So perhaps the most disturbing element of Alcala's archive, at least for us as subjects of the law, and most certainly for the arbitrators of it, is the mimicry and appropriation of the language of the law by the lawless in this case. So the serial killer is firmly situated outside of all laws and in opposition to organizations of power who negotiate their authority between the public and the private spheres. On the one hand, organizations of control are public structures, they're public organizations who rely on outward manifestations of power to exist in the first place. So the public control of subjects is kind of their main deal and relies on methods that are self-evident and proprietary to the organizations themselves. So in this sense, the serial killer who wields his, and it's almost always a man, there are very few female serial killers, who wields his power must do it in secret, must do it in motel rooms and in personal living spaces, in houses, in private spheres, and do this in this way that completely and totally turns the organization's power on its head in these unregulated spaces. So the output of the functions of the archive, which controls subjects through the same processes, but purports to make a public document, is something like Alcala's serial killings, which really finds its power in seriality, in repetition, in chronology, in the processes that the law also uses to document subjects. But it's a perverted archive that someone like Rodney Alcala makes, as opposed to a public archive. So we're talking about archives, but what is an archive, right? So an archive defined as a collection of primary source documents that have accumulated over the course of an individual's lifetime. That's from Wikipedia, so we know it's true. The archive is rooted in systemic accumulation, and its subjective beyond that can be understood to serve as documentation in some form or the other. The element of the serial enters into our understanding of the archive as a body of things defined by sheer numbers, repetition, and chronology. So the personal is sublimated in favor for the general, the mass. The documents of an archive become anonymous when placed in this context, even if they are, like most objects, rife with specificity by virtue of being inserted into a series of other objects that are connected through systemic representation and organization. They are scrubbed of their prior meaning and put into this context. So the objects of an archive inevitably beg and are required to be considered together as a greater whole, and it lends the body a homogenized quality because the archive presents itself in its aims as documentary. It is understood to pay service to neutrality. When the archives are photographic, an additional element of neutrality enters into the way we are to read the body of documents. So photography, as we may know from the history of photography, it's already a form that's rooted in empiricism, in science, in the representation of reality in a visual form, and it lends archives another layer, another patina of indifference and objectivity and science. Our question as consumers of photographic archives is then how neutral and how indifferent are these archives? So I believe that the archive is a contradictory form because it insists on neutrality and discredits authorship. It presents itself as a truth, while within the archive itself, meaning is negotiable, transferable, mutual, and subjective. In the history of photography, and this is how I started getting into the question of serial photography, Bernd and Hilla Becker were German artists working in the 60s, and they popularized this straight style of photography that insisted on the accumulation of images of similar things, usually like industrial objects and buildings and spaces, and then they presented them together systemically in an unelaborated and deliberately ungorgeous manner in grids, usually. They are credited with the formulation of serial photography as a mode, and they have a lot of followers in this vein. And serial photography relies on the bureaucratic language of the archive to subvert the insistence on aestheticism and narrative and visual art. So their intention is to, and I'm quoting them, to make families of objects, to create families of motifs. Objects are motifs that become humanized and destroy one another as in nature when the older is devoured by the newer. The Beckers acknowledge here the violence inherent in repetition and the erosion of the subject that occurs in repetitive representation. So the Beckers' mode of production adheres closely to the tradition of photography as social and scientific documentation, a tradition the medium struggled against from its inception to try to give itself validity as a fine art form. So in part, the Beckers' work is a response against the struggle, defining itself through a return to the aims of the work of photographers such as August Sander, the German social documentarian of the 1930s, whose large-scale photographic archive project attempted to categorize Germans of every social milieu and profession before World War II interrupted not only his work, but the very society that he was trying to categorize and document. So the camera is a scientific tool in the hands of the early social documentarians, and the work being created is intended for the filing cabinet, the organizational storage device of the bureaucracy. When Hilda and Byrne Becker photographed as if for the filing cabinet, but displayed the images on gallery walls in grids instead, are we to understand the photographs as documents, as evidence, as art? So unlike August Sander and other photorealists producing archival social documentary bodies of work, the Beckers acknowledged that their interest in repetition was an aesthetic statement. Their serial sequential photographs have a link into Walter Benjamin's conception of the work, of the art in the age of mechanical reproduction, in their deliberate stripping away of the aura, sort of poetic transcendence of aesthetic production. And so, like this self-described erosion of subjectivity the Beckers spoke of in their serial work, the erosion of implicit significance that occurs in repetitive representation allows for new meanings to emerge from nothing more than the form, which is the repetition itself. So where this erosion is fraught for me is where the repetition of the serial refuses to acknowledge its power to erase and to remain silent. Because the archival mode of representation says to the reader, I am true, all while saying I am inherent, the link between knowledge and power is submerged because it claims itself as an aesthetic statement while appropriating the bureaucratic language of power and control that is inherently coded into the history of archival methods of photographic realism. Serial photography can remain silent while it silences. In relentless repetition, the serial format silently claims that what you are seeing is the whole truth, the total truth, and nothing but the truth. When the language of the courtroom is embedded within art, here we have the archival tendency at work. So this is sort of like a little abstract of the paper that I was writing, and this really kind of heavy theoretical work that I was focusing on when I was thinking about serial photography. And let's just take a moment to just revel in the aesthetic pleasure of this archive. And that's Rodney Alcala holding his niece or something. That was actually the only representation of himself in his own archive. He was a handsome guy. And so, you know, I really think that I super complicated my ideas about serial photography when thinking about this. And then I started thinking about what kind of work I wanted to make after I had complicated myself and pushed myself to the end of language and to the end of knowledge when it came to thinking about serial photography and serial killers. And I started making a work called Serial, in which I went out and mostly been photographing in California, Los Angeles area, taking pictures of the houses that serial killers have at one point lived in. And kind of beyond the aesthetic rubbernecking that happens when we look at something like Alcala's archive, I don't intend to show this work with the histories behind it. I get a lot of creeps emailing me about it because there's a lot of people who are fans of serial killers' work, and that was never my intention, was to bring in the histories and put it behind them. So the work became far more interesting to me without the stories, just focusing on the landscapes. And here's my first picture. The architecture, just the thing itself, the houses, and what they say about meaning making, about the interaction between the private and the public sphere. So in that sense, I kind of came to like an ontological understanding of subjectivity and objectivity within serial photography, like trying to understand if it's even possible for a serial photography project to be completely objective. And the play that happens between that objectivity and that subjectivity when you try to work within this format. This project and the idea that I had poured into it with all this overwrought, heavy theoretical work really led me to the end of the words and started kind of falling apart at the seams. And so this is what this project really became about, the actual falling apart at the seams of creating meaning through these documents. Serial photography will always be interesting to me for these failures, for exposing the desires of human beings to invest meaning, to even create documents in the first place, and to link them together conceptually, and to make sense of objectivity and subjectivity, and to define ultimately objectivity subjectively. So the most interesting of failures in this case.